Hello everybody and welcome back to another Hellbound Garage. Today we are back working on the Datsun, inching ever closer to finally starting this thing up for the first time in almost 5 years. But, unlike every other video, we're not actually starting here in the garage. We're going to be starting here in my home office. Now this room is being remodeled, redecorated, renovated, whatever you want to call it, as well as this is where I work every day. So I do have my work stuff here, and for that reason, we're going to be keeping you focused directly behind me, which is perfectly fine because that's the real reason we're in this room. Now I touched briefly on it in the last video, but this little stash right here is called a JimStim, and it is meant to test my MS3X. Now, as you can tell, it's in a bunch of really little pieces that have to be assembled onto this board. And this kit here covers MS1, MS2, and MS3. If you want to have it cover MS3X, which I built there, you have to have this additional kit with more pieces that builds on to this guy. So that's the goal of the first part of this video, is to get this thing all assembled. That way I can finally test my MS3X, make sure all the work that's inside that computer was done the right way. Now just real quick, I do want to mention that you can buy your MS kit, or your MS3, 2, 1, MSX. You can buy all those kits complete. You don't have to do any of this work if you don't want to. You can contact the company and they will assemble it all for you, but you're going to pay extra. Same with the JimStim kit. Not that I would understand why you would need to buy a complete one if you buy a complete ECU, but you can once again buy this stuff already complete. Just for a quick example, here is the JimStim kit, unassembled, costs you around $81, and if you go over to the JimStim assembled kit, it costs you around $120. So depending on how you value your time versus money and experience versus just getting it done, well, there's a bunch of factors, but you have both options. It just really comes down to what you value most. One last thing I want to touch on before I get started on all of this is the instructions. If you go on to DIY's site and you buy one of their disassembled kits, like this one here, if you scroll down, it will give you a link to this, and this is the instructions for how to put this together. So that's kind of what it would look like after if it was just the regular JimStim, and then it gives you a breakdown of all the stuff, you know, different versions, and if it's got the add-ons to it. But that's enough talking from me. Let's get this thing done. Now, just 100 more connections to go. It took a couple hours, over a couple of days, but here it is, the JimStim 1.5 in its completed glory. Now, because my system is a MS3X, I actually have a secondary part to this puzzle, and this will allow me to test the additional features of my MS3X that this won't. So it has been a few days, well, months probably, since that last video. I went into doing other things and kind of left this particular project alone for a while, but now we're back onto it because I need to get it done. When we last left off, the boards were completed. The problem is how do you test the tester right? These guys. Well, now if you go to DIYAutoTune where you actually buy the product and scroll down, right about here to documentation, you know, you're gonna get this JimStim website, and this website goes over how to assemble everything and whatnot. But if you look right about here, it says testing and troubleshooting. If you click on that, you end up in this section of their website, and this is really cool. This goes over how to take these jumpers, connect them to certain pins that are, I don't know if you're gonna be able to see this, certain pins that are located on the board, and you can jump power to them and test the little lights. Now, you definitely have to read this a couple of times because the wording isn't exactly the greatest, but as long as you read it and you take your time, it makes sense, as well as studying this guy here. So just quickly, I wanted to show you what it looks like as you're testing this. The biggest problem with this is making sure that your connections are soldered right and that the LEDs aren't soldered in backwards, because they do have, I think it's polarity. And if you solder them in wrong, well, then they don't light up. So that's the main purpose of this. So let me turn you back around and I'll show you an example. I'm not gonna try and explain everything completely because this is kind of beyond me. I understand the basics, but not every component that's actually going on here. But for the first step, they tell you to connect one of these 5-pin from the header to this 3.3 volt pin, and then from there we connect one of these top pins to a ground, and what that does is it completes the circuit. And now when I turn on this light, I've got lights right there, and that shows me that that circuit is good. Now it specifically says to remove the jumper from the pin, otherwise you'll cause damage if you leave it in there too long. But the same process can be done through the top six pins in this particular row, and it'll actually light up all 6 of those LEDs as you work your way down. If it doesn't, then you know you have a problem. In roughly the same manner, through the website, following the instructions on certain pins, you can put jumpers together and it will light up these LEDs up here also. Something else I wanted to show you on this is now in this particular configuration, I've moved the jumpers around according to what the website shows. Whoa. And this will actually test the RPM signal. So if you switch on power, we've got no lights going on right now, but we turn this little guy here counterclockwise, you're gonna see that it starts to blink, and I can keep turning it and you're probably not gonna see it at some point, but you know, you can make it go as fast as you want or as slow as you want. Kind of another cool feature, and that's one of the main things. You can sit here and do a bunch of testing without ever actually having this plugged to the car. So something else that I thought was really cool with this setup is, if you notice, I have 3 jumpers that are currently set up. We've got a 5 volt reference to a 5 volt reference pin on the JimStim board to the secondary JimStim. We have a second trigger pin here that is then jumpered to the cam pin on the secondary board. We have a ground wire going from the ground on the secondary board to the primary board. And what that does is it allows me to turn this on. You kind of see the dancing lights there, but then I can go over to Tuner Studio and go into test modes, down to the output test mode, and then click enable test mode. If I turn on the fuel pump, it'll turn this light on here, which is kind of cool to know that that circuit works, even though for this particular setup I'm not using that. It's on its own deal with key start. But the cool thing is, in this deal you can test the coils and you can test the injectors to make sure that everything inside the ECU has been wired correctly. So I set the output intervals to 150, which brings my RPM down to 800, which makes things more visible. And if I click start after I've got the sequence here, you can actually see, if you look closely, each one of the lights blinking, and it shows each individual coil firing coming out of the ECU onto the JimStim board, which is pretty awesome knowing that that's wired correctly in the ECU. The other thing is that in this, it also has the injector testing. So I set the output interval to the same level, which then gives me the same RPM, and I can click start after I select all, and I can watch all these guys light up. Now there's an issue with the one LED, and I think I may have soldered it in backwards, but I'm not entirely sure. I can also do sequence, just like the injectors, or just like the coils, and it'll do the same thing, minus that one LED, which I've done this before, and I think all of them were going, so who knows, maybe it's just a fault at this point, because these are just sitting in here loose. Now with this test mode enabled, you have to make sure that it hits stop for everything, turn off the fuel pump, and disable test mode, otherwise that'll do some funky things within the ECU and may cause problems when I actually go to hook it up to the car, because I messed with some settings in Tuner Studio. I'm going to make sure that I hit burn after I disable test mode, which will reset the ECU back to the way it was before. Alright, so the last thing I kind of wanted to go over, and it took me a really long time to figure this out, and honestly it's really dumb that it took this long, but I went through and I read the JimStim document, and I was reading the Mega Manual document for a very long time, and I even went on to MS Extra, which is their forum specifically for MS2, MS3, the DIYer. All your questions you're looking for, most of your answers can be there. And honestly, it didn't click until probably the 100th time reading this document. And what I am talking about is I could not get cam and crank sensor to populate on the LEDs here for the life of me. Could not figure it out. When you go into the wheel simulator information here, it talks about all the different pins and it talks about all the different switches to set it for all the different trigger wheels and inversion and a bunch of stuff that is honestly very confusing to a beginner. And I thought I had everything right, and I obviously did not. The big one is square wave versus VR signal. That's a whole nother thing. For my setup, square wave is what is going to be under. But the thing that threw me, and it finally clicked, was this 5-volt pull-up information on the JimStim website. And it's talking about needing a 50-50 signal as well as a 36-to-1 to get it to show up on Tuner Studio when you're doing all the bench testing. And I had no idea what this was talking about, and I finally was like, well, let's go for it. And I ended up running out of jumpers here, so I do apologize for my janky just wrapping wire around the pins, but it works and it's only on a ground, so we're okay there. But the setup you see now gets me my desired results. So let me show you what I have, and then I'll explain how I got there. So I can turn on the JimStim. It showed the fuel pump prime, so everything's good to go. And now, if I switch over to Tuner Studio, if you watch the engine speed as I mess with the RPM, you'll notice all the different lights popping up. So I don't know how well you're gonna be able to see this on video. Okay. Sorry, just double checked. You can in fact see this. But this is all the different things that are happening in MS3 on the secondary card. This is all the injectors. This is all of the coils, all firing. And if you look on the Tuner Studio, you'll notice that the RPM actually populates, or the engine speed. And I could not get this to happen for the life of me. So I play with it for a little while. I'm so happy. This means that everything registered. And if you notice, in one of my previous videos, I was talking about the LEDs being out. I still have one out, which once again, I assume is because I soldered it in backwards. But some of these other ones were going out, and it's simply because these two boards are sitting loose on the MS3 Extra, and just like everything else, connection is key. So that finally solved that problem, and that was the last thing I wanted to test on the MS3 unit before I actually plug it into the car, because from here I have to do a bunch of calibrations using the sensors that are on the car. So it does me zero good to try and do any kind of calibration while bench testing everything. But as a recap for anybody else looking to do this, you need a 5-volt pull-up on both the secondary and the primary trigger wheels to get it to register for an MS3X. In this particular case, for sequential injection and coil unplug ignition to register, we've got the 5-volt pin going from the primary JimStim to the secondary JimStim, or the JimStim X. We have a jumper going from the ground pin of the JimStim to the JimStim X, as well as we have the secondary trigger pin jumpered to the cam pin on the JimStim X. And with all of that, if that made any sense, that is how you get everything to register correctly on Tuner Studio while you're bench testing your MS3X after you've done building it. So here it is one more time. 5-volt jumps for your tack signal. You got your ground, the secondary trigger to the cam, 5-volt to 5-volt. At this point, everything that I wanted to test on the MS3X to make sure all my work that I did putting this unit together actually turned out okay, at least on the bench test and inside the MS3X unit itself. Could be different after I get it into the car, but that is for another video, that is for another time. This is a lot of work. I know this video is going to be very dry, and it's not for everybody. Definitely not very entertaining. but it's got information that a lot of people may not know. Some of the stuff is repetitive questions you find everywhere that nobody gives answers for, but this is kind of me figuring it all out. This is hours of searching for these answers and then just randomly saying, hey, screw it, do something, and finding out that it works. Luckily, it worked instead of frying something, which could have been really bad, but yeah. Anyways, I'm going to call this video done. Thank you for anybody that's even stuck around this long. I'm pretty sure not a whole lot of people will, but thank you for watching anyways, and thank you for your support. Until the next one.
Do what it takes, I ain't making mistakes like that. I'll put it on your face to make you go take